When I was 16, I ended up in the ER after I got mauled by my parents' dogs while they were at a wine tasting in Napa. And honestly, looking back now, I should have seen it coming because the house had been a powder keg for weeks with all those animals crammed into our 3-bedroom ranch-style home that was never meant to house that many living creatures. Red soaked through the gauze on my arms as the doctor stitched up the worst bite on my shoulder, the one that had torn through my t-shirt and left a gash so deep I could see layers of tissue I didn't know existed. And each pull of the thread felt like a reminder of how completely my life had spiraled into this bizarre nightmare of dog food schedules and breaking up territorial disputes instead of worrying about SATs and prom like a normal teenager. "We need to contact your parents immediately," the ER nurse said while examining the puncture wounds covering both my forearms, her fingers gentle but clinical as she cataloged each injury with a concerned furrow in her brow that told me she'd seen neglect before, but maybe not quite like this. "They're at a wine festival, but their phone goes straight to voicemail when they're tasting," I explained, trying to keep my voice steady, even though my whole body was shaking from the adrenaline crash and the horror of watching my own blood pool on the kitchen floor before the ambulance arrived. She stared at me with this expression I'd learned to recognize over the years, the one that said, "This is not normal," but I'd become so numb to abnormal that I barely registered it anymore. "They don't answer during emergencies?" she asked, her voice pitched higher with disbelief. "They say tastings are sacred time and nothing should interrupt the wine experience." I repeated their exact words I'd heard so many times they'd lost all meaning, like a mantra that justified every abandonment and every time I'd needed them, but got sent straight to voicemail instead. The nurse tried calling anyway, her jaw tightening with each ring that went unanswered, and shook her head after the 5th attempt, looking at me with a mixture of pity and something else I couldn't quite identify, maybe anger on my behalf that I'd never learned to feel for myself. "They don't know about the attack yet because it just happened an hour ago," I said, remembering the chaos of teeth and fur and my own screaming as I'd tried desperately to pull Diesel off Thor while the other dogs circled and then joined in, drawn by the scent of blood and the frenzy of the fight. "How many dogs do you have?" asked the doctor as he cleaned another wound, his voice carefully neutral in that way medical professionals have when they're trying not to show alarm. "Right now we have 9, but last week we had 11. 2 got rehomed when they kept attacking each other," I said, wincing as the antiseptic burned into the torn flesh. He stopped mid-stitch, the needle suspended in the air between us, and I watched his face process this information. 9 dogs? In one house?" he repeated, like he needed to hear it again to believe it. I nodded, feeling the pull of the stitches already completed in my shoulder. "My parents run a rescue, except it's not official, and they don't actually rescue them. They just see cute dogs online and buy them," I explained, thinking about all the nights I'd watched my mom scroll through puppy listings on sketchy websites while sipping her evening Chardonnay, cooing over photos like they were shoes she wanted to add to her collection. "Who takes care of 9 dogs?" he prompted, and I could hear the question beneath the question. "Me, obviously, since my parents travel 4 days a week for their wine blog," I said, and the words tasted bitter coming out, like I was finally hearing how insane it all sounded when I said it out loud to someone who wasn't already living in this dysfunction with me. The doctor and nurse exchanged looks, one of those silent conversations adults have over kids' heads, and I felt suddenly exposed, like the overhead fluorescent lights were spotlights revealing every crack in the facade I'd been maintaining. "How long have you been the primary caretaker for these animals?" the doctor asked carefully, his hands pausing in their work. "Since I was 12 and they brought home the first 3 puppies from a backyard breeder," I said, remembering that weekend when my whole life changed, when I went from being a kid who did homework and played soccer to being the unpaid kennel manager of an increasingly chaotic household. "And now you're 16 managing 9 dogs alone?" the nurse asked, her voice soft with concern. "Well, technically 11, if you count the 2 they're picking up tomorrow from some guy on Craigslist selling wolf hybrids," I added, and I saw the nurse's face go pale. The nurse actually gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Wolf hybrids? Those require special permits and experienced handlers," she exclaimed, her professional composure cracking. "Yeah, my parents think they're just big fluffy dogs and have already named them Pinot and Grigio," I said, and I would have laughed at the absurdity if my arms weren't on fire with pain, and if the weight of it all wasn't suddenly crushing down on me in this sterile room with these 2 strangers who seemed to care more about my well-being than my own parents did. The doctor paused before opening his mouth again, and I could see him choosing his words carefully. "When was the last time you went to school without rushing home for feeding time?" he asked. I tried to think, scrolling back through months and months of the same routine, the same panic about getting home before the dogs destroyed something or hurt each other. "Maybe freshman year before we got dogs 4 through 6? I said uncertainly, though even that felt generous because the responsibility had been building gradually, like water rising so slowly you don't notice you're drowning until it's over your head. "And when did you last hang out with friends without canceling for a dog emergency?" he continued, his voice gentle but insistent. The silence stretched too long as I tried to remember a single time in recent memory when I'd been able to just be a teenager, when I hadn't had to text my friends some excuse about why I couldn't make it to the movies or the mall or someone's birthday party, because I had to get home to feed the dogs or break up a fight or clean up the destruction they'd caused. When did you last sleep through the night without breaking up fights or cleaning up accidents? The nurse added, and I felt tears prickling behind my eyes because the answer was never. I never slept through the night. I'd forgotten what it felt like to wake up naturally instead of to snarling or yelping or the sound of something expensive being destroyed. My throat felt tight, my chest constricting with emotions I'd been pushing down for years. The dogs need schedules and training, and I'm the only one who bothers, I managed to say, my voice cracking on the last word. Sweetheart, the nurse said gently, pulling up a stool to sit at my eye level. You're not a professional trainer. You're a child who needs stitches from trying to separate fighting animals. And the kindness in her voice broke something inside me that I'd been holding together with sheer stubborn determination. That's when animal control walked in and my heart stopped. Literally felt like it seized in my chest because I knew what this meant. I knew this was the moment everything changed. We received a report of a dangerous dog attack involving a minor, the officer said officially, his uniform and badge making everything suddenly very real and very serious. The dogs aren't dangerous. They're just stressed and untrained and kept in too small a space and fed inconsistently and never exercised properly, and I heard myself making excuses. The same excuses I'd been making to neighbors and teachers and anyone who questioned our situation, and stopped because they sounded hollow even to my own ears. The officer pulled out his tablet, his expression professional but not unkind. How many animals on the property? He asked, stylus poised. 9 dogs ranging from 15 to 90 pounds, I answered, thinking about little Daisy the terrier mix all the way up to Bruno the mastiff who took up half the couch. Are they licensed? He continued, checking boxes. I shook my head, knowing each answer was digging the hole deeper. Vaccinated? He asked. Some of them maybe, but I don't know where my parents keep the records if they exist, I admitted, remembering my frantic searches through their disorganized filing cabinet whenever someone asked. Fixed? He continued down his checklist. Only 2 because my mom thinks it's mean to take away their manhood even though 3 females have had puppies, I said, cringing at how ridiculous it sounded, at how my mother had actually used those words while I'd begged her to be responsible. He wrote furiously, his stylus tapping rapidly against the screen. Any previous bite incidents? He asked, not looking up. Well, there was the mailman and the neighbor's kid and that jogger, but my parents said those don't count because no one pressed charges, I said in a rush, watching his eyebrows climb higher with each incident I listed. My dad burst through the door reeking of Merlot and rage, his face flushed red from wine and anger, his expensive button-down shirt slightly untucked in a way that would normally mortify him, but now just made him look disheveled and drunk. What the hell did you do that required us to leave an exclusive $800 tasting? He demanded, not even looking at my injuries, his eyes blazing with fury at the inconvenience I'd caused. As my mom trailed behind him, tottering slightly on her heels and clutching her designer purse like a shield, I lifted my bandaged arms, the white gauze already showing spots of red seeping through. Diesel and Thor got into it over food, and when I tried to separate them, the other dogs joined in. I explained, my voice small, already bracing for the blame I knew was coming. Fire burned in his eyes, that look I'd seen 1,000 times when I'd disappointed him, which was often. You stupid girl, do you know how embarrassing it was getting called out of the grand tasting? He snarled, and I felt myself shrinking, becoming smaller, the way I always did under his anger. Sir, your daughter has over 30 bite wounds requiring medical attention, the doctor interrupted, his voice hard with barely controlled anger on my behalf. She's being dramatic as usual and probably provoked them somehow, my dad said dismissively, waving his hand like my injuries were an inconvenience, a performance, something I'd manufactured for attention. Sir, I'm mandated to report this. The officer stepped forward, his presence suddenly more imposing. 9 unlicensed, unvaccinated dogs in one home with a minor as sole caretaker constitutes neglect and endangerment. My dad ignored the officer completely, his focus laser-fixed on me, and went off on me like I was the problem, like I was the one who'd created this situation. Those dogs are worth thousands of dollars, he shouted, his voice echoing off the hospital walls. Dad, I needed 14 stitches and a tetanus shot, I said, my voice breaking, trying to make him see me, really see me for once. He snarled, his face contorting with rage and something uglier. Do you have any idea what this emergency room visit will cost our insurance? The officer closed his tablet with a decisive snap that cut through the tension. All animals will be removed pending investigation, and you'll be prohibited from adopting any animals for 5 years minimum, he said with finality. And I thought that would be the end. Update. Hospital kept me overnight for observation because the doctor worried about infection from the deep bites. And I lay awake staring at the ceiling tiles while my parents sent angry text after angry text about how I ruined their weekend and embarrassed them in front of the animal control officer. The nurses checked on me every 2 hours, taking my temperature and examining the bandages, and I could tell from their careful expressions they'd read the case notes about what was happening at home. Constance Hanks from CPS showed up at 7 in the morning before my parents could take me home, introducing herself with a kind but serious face that told me this was really happening. She asked me questions about my daily routine with the dogs, my school attendance, when I last had a full night's sleep, and I watched her face grow more worried with each answer I gave. The hospital social worker arranged for me to be released into temporary CPS custody rather than going home with my parents. And my dad completely lost it in the hallway, yelling about government overreach and threatening lawsuits while my mom cried about how I was tearing the family apart. Constance stayed calm and explained that I'd be staying with her and her husband Barrett for a few days while they completed their home investigation, and I felt this weird mix of relief and guilt that made my stomach hurt. Barrett Hanks picked me up from the hospital in their family van, making gentle small talk about nothing important while I held my discharge papers and tried not to cry. Their house was quiet and clean, with just one old golden retriever who slept on a dog bed in the corner, and seeing that made me realize how crazy my life had been. I slept for 14 hours straight in the guest room, waking up confused because no dogs were fighting and nothing was destroyed and no one needed me. Constance made me breakfast and didn't ask pushy questions, just told me I was safe here, and we'd figure everything out one step at a time. Animal control finished removing all 9 dogs from my parents' house over the next 2 days, and my mom called me sobbing about how empty the house felt and how could I do this to them. I felt terrible guilt, even though I knew I didn't cause this. I just got hurt badly enough that people finally noticed what was happening. My parents got formally banned from getting any new animals and received citations for multiple violations, including unlicensed animals, failure to vaccinate, and child endangerment. The wolf hybrid purchase got blocked when animal control contacted the seller on the internet and explained the situation, and my dad left me a voicemail calling me a nasty little bitch who destroyed their dreams. Constance did a formal interview with me about my living situation, and I told her everything: the 4 years of being sole caretaker, the missed school and friendships, the constant exhaustion, the previous bite incidents my parents covered up. She recorded it all carefully, and I watched her professional mask slip a few times when I described particularly bad incidents. 3 days after I moved in with the Hanks, Coleman Bauer from next door contacted Constance directly to provide testimony about what he'd seen over the years. He told her about the constant barking at all hours, the visible neglect of the property with dog waste piling up in the yard, my parents leaving for days at a time while I was clearly alone managing everything. He said he regretted not calling sooner, especially after he saw me trying to break up a dog fight in the backyard 6 months ago, and I'd gotten knocked down hard. His statement included specific dates and incidents he'd documented, times he'd heard me screaming at the dogs to stop fighting, mornings he'd seen me leave for school looking exhausted with visible scratches on my arms. I went back to the school after a week away, and everyone stared at my bandaged arms as I walked through the hallways. The rumors had already spread about the dog attack and CPS involvement, and I heard whispers following me between classes. Frances Schroeder pulled me into her office during lunch, closing the door gently behind us. She told me her door was always open, that I could come sit in her office whenever I needed a quiet space, and I almost cried because no adult at the school had ever really seen me before. She'd already talked to my teachers about what happened and arranged for me to get extensions on assignments, and for the first time someone at the school was actually helping, instead of just marking me absent. 2 days later, Constance took me to my first therapy appointment with a counselor who worked with family trauma and neglect cases. I sat there stubbornly insisting I was fine, that I'd handled everything okay, that other kids had it worse. The therapist gently pointed out that being the sole caretaker of 9 dogs at age 12 wasn't fine, that missing school constantly wasn't normal, that getting mauled trying to break up dog fights wasn't something I should have had to deal with. I left angry and defensive, not ready to admit how messed up everything was, because that meant facing how much my parents had failed me. My parents requested a supervised visit, which Constance set up at the CPS office the following week. They spent the entire hour trying to convince me to tell everyone I exaggerated, that I wanted to come home, that we could be a family again if I just cooperated with them. I watched them perform concern and love for Constance's benefit, while their eyes told me I'd betrayed them, and I realized they'd never actually see what they did wrong. They kept saying the dogs were gone now so everything would be different, but they didn't understand the dogs were just a symptom of their bigger problems. Barrett sat me down one evening after dinner and gently told me they'd found something during the investigation. He showed me bank statements Constance had gotten through legal channels, statements from my college fund account. The account that should have had over $40,000 in it had $312 left. My parents had been using my college fund to pay for their wine blog trips and dog purchases for years. I felt something break inside me because they'd stolen my future to fund their hobbies, and they'd never even told me they were taking the money. 2 weeks after the dogs got removed, my mom started texting me photos of a litter of puppies she found online. The messages said how cute they were and how we could start fresh with just 1 or 2 well-trained dogs this time. I stared at my phone in disbelief because she genuinely didn't understand they had a problem, or that they'd been banned from getting animals. I took screenshots of everything and sent them to Constance right away. Constance filed a report about my parents' attempted violation of the animal ban, and the judge issued a stern warning that any further attempts would result in criminal charges. My dad sent me a furious email the next day blaming me for getting them in more trouble, calling me ungrateful after everything they'd sacrificed raising me. The email went on for paragraphs about how I'd ruined their lives and destroyed their reputation in the community. Frances noticed I was struggling in class and having trouble concentrating, so she arranged for me to get extensions on assignments and makeup work for all the days I'd missed. She coordinated with my teachers, who were surprisingly understanding once they knew the real situation, instead of just seeing my absences. For the first time since middle school, I was able to focus on homework without constantly worrying about what was destroyed at home or which dogs were fighting. Keith Molina, a public defender assigned to represent my interests in the court proceedings, met with me at the CPS office to explain my rights and options. He was straightforward about the process, telling me the court would decide whether it was safe for me to return home, and that my voice mattered in this decision. It felt strange because my parents had never cared about my opinion on anything, but now a judge would actually listen to what I wanted. The preliminary court hearing happened 3 weeks after my hospital visit, and I had to testify about my daily life with the dogs, while my parents sat across the courtroom looking betrayed. I described the feeding schedules, the constant fights, the cleaning up after 9 dogs, the years of being responsible for animals I never wanted. The judge reviewed all the evidence, my medical records showing over 30 bite wounds, the animal control reports documenting the violations, Coleman's neighbor testimony about the neglect, the bank statements showing my depleted college fund. She ordered my parents to complete parenting classes, anger management, and psychological evaluation before reunification could even be considered, and set another hearing date for 3 months out to review their progress. My parents finished their court-ordered anger management and parenting classes over the next 6 weeks, but showed up to every supervised visit at the CPS office complaining about how unfair the whole system was treating them. They sat across from me in the sterile meeting room with Constance taking notes in the corner, and spent the entire hour talking about how they were being persecuted for loving animals too much, instead of asking how my shoulder was healing or whether I was sleeping better. My mom brought printouts of online articles about animal rescue heroes and kept sliding them across the table like evidence of their good intentions, while my dad ranted about government overreach and how CPS destroys families. Constance documented everything in her laptop, her fingers moving steadily across the keys as my parents dug themselves deeper with every word, and I watched them perform concern while their eyes stayed cold and angry. They never once said they were sorry for my injuries, or acknowledged that maybe 9 dogs in a small house with a teenager as sole caretaker was wrong. I started understanding during those visits that wanting someone to change, and them actually being capable of change, were completely different things. Willow Langley sent me a message on Instagram 3 weeks into my stay with the Hanks, saying she heard what happened through people at the school, and asking if I wanted to meet up. My hands shook reading her message because Willow was my best friend freshman year, before the dog situation exploded, and I disappeared from everyone's life, and I was scared she'd judge me or think I was pathetic for letting things get so bad. We met at the coffee shop near school on a Saturday morning, and I walked in expecting awkwardness, but she stood up from her table and hugged me tight before I could even sit down. She told me she missed me and had wondered for 2 years why I just vanished from her life, stopped answering texts, and turned down every invitation, until she finally stopped asking. I tried explaining about the dogs and the constant emergencies, and never having time for anything, but she cut me off and said she understood now, and wished she'd pushed harder to figure out what was wrong. I cried right there in the coffee shop with other customers staring, because I'd forgotten what having a real friend felt like, what it was like when someone actually cared about you, instead of just needing you to manage their chaos. The Hanks let me stay with them for 2 full months while the court process dragged on, and they treated me like an actual person, instead of a burden they were stuck with. Constance asked about my day when I got home from the school and helped me with homework at the kitchen table, and Barrett was included me in family dinners where we talked about normal things like movies and weekend plans. Their daughter Emma was a year younger than me and taught me how to just watch TV without jumping up every 5 minutes listening for dog fights, how to sleep past 6 in the morning on Saturdays without feeling guilty about feeding schedules. Emma showed me her photography from art class and invited me to her soccer games, and introduced me to her friends like it was normal for a foster kid to suddenly appear in her life. I learned what stable looked like, what it felt like to live somewhere quiet where adults actually parented instead of dumping everything on their kid while they pursued their hobbies. The court-ordered psychological evaluations came back in thick manila envelopes that Constance reviewed with me in her office. The psychologist's report said my dad showed narcissistic personality traits with poor insight into his behavior's impact on others, and my mom had hoarding disorder specifically related to animals with compulsive acquisition patterns she couldn't control. Both evaluations noted minimal awareness of how their choices affected me, and the psychologist recommended against reunification without intensive long-term treatment spanning at least 18 months. My parents' lawyer sent a response rejecting the findings and insisting they didn't need therapy because they weren't the problem. I was just a dramatic teenager who exaggerated normal family responsibilities. Constance showed me their response, and I saw my parents were never going to admit they did anything wrong, never going to get the help they needed because they genuinely believed they were fine and everyone else was crazy. 4 months after the hospital visit, I was sitting in Frances's office during lunch period doing makeup work when she closed her gradebook and asked me what I actually wanted for my life. Not what the court wanted or my parents wanted or CPS recommended, but what I wanted. And the question caught me off guard because no adult had ever asked me that before. I sat there thinking about the question while Frances waited patiently and realized I wanted to finish high school without constant crisis, wanted to go to college, and study something I cared about, wanted to have friends and go to football games and do normal teenage things. I told Frances I didn't want to go back to being my parents' unpaid kennel manager and emotional punching bag, didn't want to sacrifice my entire future managing their dysfunction while they traveled for wine tastings and ignored every problem they created. Keith met with me the following week to help write a statement for the court, explaining why I didn't feel safe going home. We sat in a conference room at his office and he asked questions while I talked, and he typed everything into his laptop, organizing my scattered thoughts into clear paragraphs. I told him my parents hadn't shown genuine change, still blamed me for everything, refused to get real help, and I needed stability to finish school and prepare for college. Keith printed the statement and had me read it over and make changes until it said exactly what I needed to say. Then we practiced me reading it out loud because I'd have to present it to the judge. My voice shook the first few times, but Keith was patient, and by the end I could get through it without crying, and he told me I was brave for speaking up for myself. The final hearing happened on a Tuesday morning, and I sat at the table next to Keith while my parents and their lawyer sat across the courtroom glaring at me like I was the enemy. The judge reviewed all the evidence again, including the psychological evaluations, my statement, Constance's reports documenting my parents' lack of progress, and the original medical records from the hospital. She asked my parents directly if they understood why their home wasn't safe for me, and my dad launched into a speech about government persecution, while my mom cried that I was tearing the family apart. The judge cut them off and said she'd heard enough, that reunification wasn't in my best interests given their continued denial and lack of insight, and ordered I remain in foster care through high school with supervised visitation only. My parents stood up immediately and stormed toward the exit, and my dad turned back to yell that I was dead to them, that they never wanted to see me again. And it hurt hearing those words, but also felt like permission to stop hoping they'd magically become the parents I needed. Constance and Barrett asked to speak with me privately after the hearing, and we sat in a quiet room down the hall from the courtroom. They explained they'd been approved as a long-term foster placement and asked if I wanted to stay with them instead of moving to a stranger's home. And I said yes before they even finished the question because they'd shown me what stable, supportive adults looked like. The paperwork took 3 weeks to process, but then it was official with signatures and court stamps making it real, and I had a safe place to live where no one expected me to sacrifice my entire life, managing someone else's chaos and dysfunction. I started catching up on everything I'd missed once I wasn't constantly exhausted and crisis managing. I joined the school photography club that Emma was in, and learned how to use the darkroom and went to football games on Friday nights with Willow and her friends. I slept through entire nights without waking up to dogfights or destruction, and my body slowly stopped being on constant alert waiting for the next emergency. My grades jumped from barely passing to mostly B's within 2 months, and my teachers kept commenting on how different I seemed, more awake and present and engaged in class instead of just surviving each day. My parents maintained contact through supervised visits every few weeks at the CPS office, but nothing changed in how they saw the situation. They still insisted they did nothing wrong and I was being dramatic about normal family stuff, that other kids had chores and responsibilities, so what made me so special? I stopped trying to make them understand and started accepting they were never going to be the parents I deserved, and that was sad, but it wasn't my fault, or my responsibility to fix them. Frances pulled me into her office one afternoon with a stack of college brochures and scholarship applications spread across her desk. She'd already highlighted programs that offered full rides for foster youth, and printed out information about the educational training voucher that could give me up to $5,000 a year for school expenses. I sat there staring at the papers because I'd assumed college was completely off the table after my parents drained my fund. But Frances kept pointing to different programs and explaining how my foster status actually qualified me for aid most kids couldn't get. We spent 3 hours going through websites and filling out preliminary applications for schools with strong social work programs, because I kept thinking about how maybe I could help other kids stuck in situations like mine, kids who needed someone to actually see what was happening. Frances helped me write my personal statement about the dogs and the neglect, and how it taught me that sometimes the system works when people finally pay attention, and she only cried a little bit when she read my first draft. 6 months after I ended up in the hospital with 30 bite wounds, I was sitting in the Hanks' living room doing homework with Emma, while their old golden retriever snored on his bed, and everything felt surreal in how normal it was. My grades had jumped to mostly A's because I could actually focus in class instead of worrying about which dogs were fighting or what was getting destroyed at home. Willow and I went to football games on Friday nights, and I joined the photography club and went to Emma's soccer matches and did all the boring regular teenager stuff I'd missed for 4 years. The scars on my arms were fading to pale pink lines that I didn't bother covering up anymore because they were just proof of what happened. Proof that I survived and got out and people finally saw. I had a stable place to live with adults who actually cared if I ate breakfast and did my homework and got enough sleep. The college acceptance letters started arriving in March, and I got into 3 schools with financial aid packages that would cover almost everything. My parents still showed up for supervised visits every few weeks, insisting they'd done nothing wrong, but I'd stopped trying to make them understand, because I had my own future to focus on now.